What's going on, everybody? Welcome back into the Fantasy Pros YouTube channel. My name is Lucas Wencl, and today we're talking about 10 players that you can look to drop after week 14 of fantasy football to make room for those waiver wire ads for round 1 of the fantasy playoffs. As always, we'll cover guys both in deep leagues and shallow leagues. But before we dive on into that list, if you want a chance at winning a signed Jackson Smith and Jigba Seahawks helmet for free, courtesy of our friends at pristineauction.com, all you need to do is head to fantasypros.com/contest, complete the form, and either download the Fantasy Pros My Playbook app, leave a review for the podcast, or follow us on X, Instagram, or TikTok at Fantasy Pros. The more actions you complete, the more entries you receive. We'll be announcing a winner right here on the podcast, so if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to subscribe and turn on those notifications so you can be alerted when new episodes are up and to come claim your prize when we announce it. Kicking off our list this week is Las Vegas Raiders running back Ameer Abdullah. He was fun in weeks 10 and 11 coming out of the team's bye, but has now given you 2 straight weekly finishes as the running back 40 or worse. Undrafted free agent in the 2022 NFL draft, Sincere McCormick, has been getting majority of the run ahead of Abdullah, playing 61% of the snaps and getting 17 of 20 running back opportunities last week. Eventually, one of Alexander Mattison or Zamir White will return to the lineup and spell Abdullah even further. On a sputtering offense like the Raiders, it's tough to justify Abdullah as a rosterable piece in any league format because he's barely even a handcuff once this unit is at full strength. He can be dropped in all league formats. The next player you can look to drop this week is Wan'Dale Robinson, wide receiver for the New York Giants. It's officially time to throw in the towel on a good run for PPR scam Wan'Dale Robinson because it's not working at all with Drew Lock under center. In the last 2 games with Drew Lock, Wan'Dale has finished as the wide receiver 44 and the wide receiver 98, knocking him out of flex consideration entirely. The volume hasn't been there either over the last 6 contests. To start the season, Wan'Dale drew 8 or more targets in 6 of the first 7 weeks. Since week 8 though, he's averaging less than 6 targets per game. The ceiling was already low with Robinson to begin with, and now there's virtually no ceiling whatsoever with how bad the quarterback play has been. Even with great matchups against Baltimore and Atlanta coming up, Wan'Dale can't be trusted whatsoever and can be dropped in almost every league format. Our next player you can drop this week is Baltimore Ravens wide receiver Diontae Johnson. I made the note in my video last week that you and I played as many snaps and ran just as many routes as Diontae Johnson did in week 13. The info I didn't have at that point, though, is that Diontae willingly sat out of this game because of his frustration. What John Harbaugh apparently needed to figure out was how much of a punishment was warranted for his misconduct. Now, Diontae is suspended for 1 game and is set to give you 0 production for the 5th time in 6 weeks since becoming a Baltimore Raven. There is absolutely 0 reason to be holding on to Diontae at this point and is droppable in every league format. Another wide receiver you can look to drop this week is Nick Westbrook-Ikhine of the Tennessee Titans. This felt all too predictable. Westbrook-Ikhine scores 8 times in 8 games. Fantasy managers finally start to pick up on this ridiculous trend. They throw him into their lineups, but they're 3 weeks too late and he finishes with only 2.9 fantasy points when they start him. Regression was going to happen eventually because touchdowns were the only thing you were banking on with Westbrook-Ikhine during his 8-game stretch. Since week 6, he's only had 1 game with more than 3 receptions, and he only had 2 games with more than 50 receiving yards. Now that we're into the fantasy playoffs, he can't be trusted in your lineups, especially after potentially costing you a win in week 14 if you started him. In the deepest of leagues, you can keep Westbrook-Ikhine stashed, but in shallower leagues, let him be someone else's headache. Our next player that you can drop this week is Raheem Mostert, running back for the Miami Dolphins. This year has been a fantasy disaster for Mostert, giving you only 3 finishes inside of the top 40 running backs on the season. He wound up missing week 14 against the Jets with a hip injury, but his value has been plummeting ever since week 10. He only has 10 rush attempts in his last 4 games and hasn't given you more than 5.4 points in a game during that stretch. Rookie running back Jalen Wright has been seeing more snaps than Mostert as well, and should he return in week 15, he gets a daunting stretch rest of the season, drawing the Texans, Browns, and Jets in 3 of his last 4 games. I understand wanting to hold on to Raheem Mostert in the deepest of leagues, but in 10 to 14 man leagues, he could be sent to the waiver wire. The next player to consider cutting is Chicago Bears tight end Kmet. Every time you're ready to be out on Kmet, he gives you 1 solid game to draw you back in. But here's the reality now that we're 14 weeks through the season. Kmet has only given you 3 finishes inside of the top 12 tight ends. That means 78% of the time this year, Kmet has been unstartable. In his last 7 games, he's only given you 2 finishes inside of the top 30 tight ends, including 2 goose eggs during that stretch. Hunter Henry has been much more productive as of late, and he's rostered in 10% less of leagues. the fact still remains that Kmet is the fourth option in this Bears passing attack, and that's not a piece worth rostering on your team with his lack of production, especially if he's your backup tight end. You should waste no time dropping him in any shallow league format. Unless you're playing in a 2-quarterback or superflex league, you can look to part ways with Atlanta Falcons quarterback Kirk Cousins. You've heard the stat by now, but Kirk Cousins has 0 touchdowns and 8 interceptions in his last 4 games, which have all resulted in losses for the Atlanta Falcons. Since week 10, of all quarterbacks with at least 30 pass attempts, Kirk is dead last in fantasy points per dropback and has finished no better than the quarterback 17 during that stretch. Kirk is barely a streaming option at this point, and there is 0 reason you should be keeping him on your roster as a second quarterback. The noise is only going to get louder for Michael Penix to take over, especially if the Falcons continue to fumble their playoff hopes. Give yourself some extra flexibility on your roster by ditching Kirk Cousins, who likely isn't going to help you at all during the fantasy playoffs. Another tight end you can look to drop this week is Dallas Goedert of the Philadelphia Eagles. This one is somewhat low-hanging fruit, but like Austin Eckler last week, I feel the need to emphasize that Goedert should be cut instead of stashed in your IR spot. Goedert is eligible to return in week 18 should he be fully healthy. The problem though is that the majority of fantasy playoffs end in week 17 to avoid the hassle of NFL teams benching their starters before the playoffs. Unfortunately, Goedert will likely find himself in that exact scenario as the Eagles have already clinched a playoff spot. If your championship runs through week 18, I highly doubt you'd have Goedert available, as the team may elect to keep him out until they need him in the postseason. If your league allows it, you can use your IR spot in more creative ways to give you an edge in the playoffs, so don't clog it up with Goedert and let him go to the waiver wire instead. The next cut candidate we're going to talk about is Kansas City Chiefs running back Kareem Hunt. The tide has turned very quickly back to Isaiah Pacheco's favor, and the standalone value has completely evaporated for Kareem Hunt. Pacheco played 32 snaps to Hunt's 20 and got 18 opportunities compared to Hunt's 6. This has now marked back-to-back weeks where Hunt has had less than 20 rushing yards and scored less than 4 fantasy points on the week. That likely won't change going forward, unfortunately, as the Chiefs draw the Browns and Texans in their next 2 matchups, who are both bottom 7 in fantasy points allowed to running backs this year. In the deepest of leagues, Kareem Hunt is still worth the stash as a handcuff, but in shallow leagues, Hunt can be dropped to the waiver wire. And lastly, you could consider sending Atlanta Falcons tight end Kyle Pitts to the waiver wire this week. This one is for those of you playing in the shallowest of leagues, and it still may be hard to part ways with Pitts knowing what upside he has. The problem is he's been virtually unplayable since week 8. He gave you a tight end 12 finish in week 10, but outside of that, he's finished as a tight end 32 or worse in 4 of his last 5 games and caught 1 or fewer passes in those games. This is a gut-wrenching stretch for Kyle Pitts, who started to finally show signs of life of a potential breakout between weeks 5 through 8, but he's created your team ever since if you've been starting him. With how poorly Kirk has been playing as well, there's little optimism to hold on to here, so if you're in a shallow league and need permission to move on from Kyle Pitts, consider this your sign to do so. Alrighty, y'all, that's it. That's all I've got for you here today, but before we sign off, remember, if you want a chance at winning a signed Jackson Smith and Jigba Seahawks helmet for free, courtesy of our friends at pristineauction.com, all you need to do is head to fantasypros.com/contest, complete the form, and either download the Fantasy Pros My Playbook app, leave a review for the podcast, or follow us on X, Instagram, or TikTok at FantasyPros. The more actions you complete, the more entries you receive. We'll be announcing a winner right here on the podcast, so if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to subscribe and turn on those notifications so you can be alerted when new episodes are up and to come claim your prize when we announce it.